The candles had not even burned halfway down when Clara Whitmore pulled the pins from her hair and ran. Her wedding dress caught on the garden hedge as she pushed through it, the silk tearing at the hem, but she did not stop to look. Behind her, the great house of Ashcombe glowed with light from every window, and somewhere inside it, her husband of 6 hours was likely still standing in the hallway outside their bedroom door, waiting for a wife who was never coming back to him that night. She had married a duke that morning. She had promised to love him, honor him, and stay beside him until death. She had meant every word when she said it, and that was the strange, aching part of it all. It was not that she did not want to keep her promise. It was that she could not make her body walk back through that door and lie beside a man she barely knew, not tonight, not when the fear inside her chest felt like a fist closing tighter with every breath. Gideon Hartley, the Duke of Ashcombe, was not a cruel man. She knew that much. She had heard it from the servants, from her own mother, from the quiet way he had held her hand during the ceremony as if she were made of glass. But kindness from a stranger did not erase what had happened to her 3 years before, when another man had promised the same gentle words, and then shown her, behind closed doors, exactly how little those words had meant. She had never told anyone the whole truth of that earlier engagement. Her family believed it ended because the gentleman in question, a man named Edmund Voss, had simply lost interest and moved his attentions elsewhere. It was easier for everyone to believe that than to know what he had actually done to her in the weeks before the wedding was called off. The threats, the cold cruelty hidden behind a charming smile. She had buried it so deep that even she sometimes convinced herself it belonged to another woman, not to her. But standing in her new husband's house that night, surrounded by unfamiliar portraits and unfamiliar servants, she had felt the old fear rise up all at once, and she had done the only thing her body knew how to do. She ran. The road away from Ashcombe was dark and unfamiliar, but Clara did not need to see it clearly. She knew where she was going. There was only one place in the whole of England where she had ever felt truly safe, and it was not a grand house or a fine city street. It was a small stone cottage on the edge of a fishing village on the southern coast, where her grandmother had lived until her death 5 years before. Clara had spent every childhood summer there, running barefoot along the cliffs, learning to mend nets from the fishermen's wives, falling asleep to the sound of the sea instead of the sound of her parents arguing over money in the next room. She reached the main road just as a farmer's cart was passing, its driver an older man with a kind, weathered face who did not ask too many questions when a young woman in a torn wedding dress asked if she might ride along as far as the crossroads. He simply nodded and helped her up, and Clara spent the rest of that night moving from one borrowed ride to the next, trading the last of the coins sewn into her petticoat for passage south, until the smell of salt finally reached her on the wind, and she knew she was close. Meanwhile at Ashcombe, Gideon stood outside the door of the room that was meant to be theirs, holding the note his bride had left behind. It was short, only a few lines, and it told him almost nothing except that she was sorry, that this was not about him, and that she needed to go somewhere she could breathe. He read it 3 times before he allowed himself to feel anything at all. Gideon was not a man given to public displays of feeling. He had learned early in life, after losing his own parents when he was still a boy, that steadiness was the only thing that kept a household from falling apart, and he had built his entire adult life around that steadiness. He managed his estates with quiet precision. He spoke rarely and never wasted a word. The gossip papers called him cold, and he had long since stopped caring what they said, because the alternative, letting people see what truly moved him, felt far more dangerous. But standing there with his bride's handwriting trembling slightly on the page, he felt something crack open in his chest that he did not have a name for. He had agreed to this marriage for practical reasons. Clara's family needed the money his title and land could provide, and his own household needed an heir and a mistress to manage it, since he had been alone in that great house for far too many years. He had told himself, walking down the aisle that morning, that affection could grow later, that many marriages of their kind began this way, and turned into something real with time and patience. He had not expected to feel anything so soon. But watching her during the ceremony, the way her hands had shaken slightly as she said her vows, the way she had looked at him not with coldness but with something closer to fear, he had felt an unexpected pull toward her, a wish to protect her from whatever was frightening her so badly. And now she was gone, and that wish had turned into something sharper, something that felt almost like panic. His butler, a steady older man named Harold who had served the family for 30 years, found him still standing in the hallway an hour later. "Your Grace," he said carefully, "shall I send word to the stables?" Gideon did not answer right away. He was thinking of every conversation he'd had with Clara in the weeks leading up to the wedding, searching for some sign he had missed. some clue to where she might have gone or why she had been so afraid. She had spoken so little about her past. He realized now, standing there, how little he actually knew about the woman he had just married. "Send for my horse," he said finally, "and find out everything you can about her family, her childhood, anywhere she might have gone. I want to know within the hour." Harold hesitated. "Your Grace, forgive me, but should we not wait until morning? The roads are dark, and there will be talk if it becomes known that the Duchess has left on her wedding night." "Let them talk," Gideon said, and there was an edge in his voice that Harold had rarely heard before. "I am not interested in what London says about me tonight. I am interested in finding my wife before something happens to her out there alone." It took less than an hour for the household staff to gather what little they knew. Clara's lady's maid, a young woman named Alice who had come with her from her family home, remembered her mistress speaking fondly, more than once, of a grandmother's cottage by the sea, somewhere in the south, though she could not remember the exact village. Gideon sent riders in 3 directions before dawn, with instructions to ask after a young woman traveling alone, and he himself set out south along the coast road, following little more than instinct and the fragments Alice had given him. He rode through the night without stopping, his mind circling back again and again to the note in his coat pocket. "This is not about you," she had written. He wondered if that was true, or if it was simply what she believed she needed to say to soften the blow. Either way, he intended to find out for himself, face to face, rather than let the question sit unanswered while she was out there somewhere, frightened and alone. By the time the sun began to rise over the hills, Clara had finally reached the village of her childhood. The little cottage stood exactly as she remembered it, its stone walls weathered by salt wind, its garden overgrown but still holding the shape her grandmother had once kept it in. She stood at the gate for a long moment, feeling the tears she had held back all night finally begin to fall, not from sadness this time, but from something like relief. A light was already burning in the window. Margaret Kell, an old friend of her grandmother's who had continued to look after the cottage since her passing, opened the door before Clara even reached it, as though some old instinct had told her a Whitmore girl was coming home. Margaret took one look at the torn wedding dress, the tangled hair, the exhaustion written plainly across Clara's face, and did not ask a single question. She simply opened her arms, pulled Clara inside, and closed the door against the cold morning air. "You are safe here, child," she said quietly. "Whatever has happened, you are safe here." Clara sank onto the small wooden bench by the fire, and for the first time since the wedding vows had left her mouth the day before, she allowed herself to breathe freely. She did not know yet what would happen next, whether her husband would come looking for her, whether her family would ever forgive her for what she had done, or whether the peace she felt in this small cottage could possibly last. But for now, wrapped in a worn blanket with the sound of the sea drifting through the window, she had exactly what she had been running toward all along. She was home. Margaret busied herself at the small stove, warming water and cutting bread, her movements unhurried despite the questions that must have been forming behind her eyes. She had known Clara since the girl was small enough to be carried on her grandmother's hip, and she had learned long ago that some wounds needed food and warmth before they needed words. Clara watched her move about the kitchen, grateful beyond measure for a silence that did not demand explanation. When the bread was ready, Margaret set it before her and finally sat down across the small table, folding her weathered hands together. "I will not ask what happened until you are ready to tell me," she said. "But I will say this much. Whatever it is, you did not come here by accident. Your grandmother always said this cottage remembers the people it loves and calls them back when they need it most." Clara felt fresh tears gather at that, though she managed a small, tired smile. "I did not know where else to go," she admitted quietly. "I could not stay there. I know how that sounds. I know what it will cost me. But I could not make myself walk back into that room." Margaret did not press further. Instead she rose, fetched a spare nightdress from the small chest by the window, one that had belonged to Clara's grandmother, and helped her out of the ruined wedding gown as gently as if she were tending a wound. "There will be time enough for the rest of it," she said. "For now you will sleep, and the sea will still be here when you wake, exactly as it always has been." Clara lay down on the narrow bed tucked beneath the eaves, the same bed she had slept in every summer of her childhood, and listened to the waves breaking against the rocks below the cliff. It was a sound she had carried with her through every difficult year since her grandmother's death, through the quiet horror of her first engagement, through the anxious weeks of planning a wedding to a man she barely knew. It had always meant safety. It had always meant that whatever else was breaking apart in her life, this one place would remain unchanged. She closed her eyes, and for a few short hours, sleep finally came. Outside, far to the north, a duke rode on through the gray morning light, following a trail of fragments and instinct, more determined with every mile to find the woman who had run from him, and more uncertain than he had ever been in his life about what he would say to her when he finally did. The first days at the cottage passed in a kind of quiet Clara had almost forgotten was possible. She woke each morning to the sound of gulls and the smell of the sea instead of the closed, heavy air of a great house full of strangers. Margaret asked nothing of her beyond small tasks, gathering eggs from the 2 hens in the yard, hanging washing on the line, walking down to the market with a basket over her arm. There was something healing in the simplicity of it, in having her hands busy with small, ordinary things after months of wedding preparations that had felt like preparing for a battle rather than a marriage. She wore plain wool dresses borrowed from Margaret's own trunk, pinned her hair back simply, and let the villagers assume she was a niece come to stay for a while, helping an aging woman through the colder months. No one in the village had reason to know her as anything but that. She had spent her childhood summers here under her grandmother's roof, but that had been years ago, and the fishing families who filled the market square each morning were focused on their nets and their catch, not on a young woman with tired eyes buying bread at the corner stall. Still, the fear did not disappear entirely. It sat quietly in her chest, flaring up whenever a carriage passed through the village or a stranger lingered too long near the cottage gate. She knew, somewhere beneath the relief, that this peace could not last forever. She had not simply left a difficult evening behind. She had left a duke standing alone in his own house, and men of his position did not let such things go unanswered, whatever their reasons for marrying in the first place. Margaret noticed the way Clara's eyes would flick toward the road sometimes, the way her shoulders would tense at the sound of hooves in the distance. On the third evening, as they sat together mending a fishing net for one of the local families in exchange for a share of the catch, Margaret finally spoke what had clearly been on her mind since Clara's arrival. "You do not have to tell me everything, child," she said, her needle moving steadily through the rope. "But I think it would help you to tell me something. You are carrying a great deal alone, and a burden shared is always lighter than a burden hidden." Clara set down her own section of the net, staring into the small fire that kept the evening chill from the cottage. "It is not that I do not trust him," she said slowly. "The Duke, I mean. He has been nothing but patient with me. It is that I do not trust myself around men who ask nothing of me at first, because I have been wrong about that once before, and it nearly cost me everything." She told Margaret then, in halting pieces, about Edmund Voss, about the engagement 3 years before that had seemed, in its early weeks, so full of promise. About the way his kindness had slowly curdled into control once the wedding date drew near, the way he had begun to isolate her from her friends, to criticize her in private while charming everyone else in public, to frighten her with a cold, quiet anger whenever she did not do exactly as he wished. She told her about the final weeks before the engagement ended, weeks she had never spoken of to another living soul, when his patience had run out entirely, and she had understood, with a clarity that still made her hands shake, exactly what kind of life awaited her if she married him. Her family had never learned the full truth. It had been easier, in the aftermath, to let everyone believe Edmund had simply lost interest, that the match had ended for reasons of his own making, rather than admit what he had actually done. Clara had carried the shame of it alone ever since, certain that if anyone truly knew, they would think less of her for staying as long as she had, for not seeing the danger sooner. Margaret listened without interrupting, her hands finally stilling on the net. When Clara finished, she reached across the small space between them and took her hand firmly. "There is no shame in what happened to you," she said, her voice steady and sure. "The shame belongs entirely to him, and to no one else. You survived something cruel, and you found the courage to leave before it destroyed you completely. That is not weakness, Clara. That is strength most people never have to find." Clara felt something loosen in her chest that had been tightly wound for 3 long years. It was the first time she had said the words aloud, the first time she had let herself be truly seen in the wreckage of that earlier engagement, and instead of judgment, she had found only understanding. "But I still do not know what to do about the Duke," she admitted. "He does not deserve to be humiliated the way I have humiliated him. Whatever else is true, he did not do anything to earn what I did to him on our wedding night." "Perhaps not," Margaret agreed. "But fear does not always wait to ask whether it is fair. Sometimes it simply arrives, and we are left to deal with the consequences afterward. The question now is not whether you were wrong to run. The question is what you intend to do next." That question followed Clara through the following days like a shadow she could not quite shake. She threw herself into the small routines of village life, helping Margaret at the market, learning again the names of the fishing families she had known as a child, walking the cliff paths in the early evenings when the light turned gold over the water. Slowly, piece by piece, she began to feel like herself again, not the frightened bride who had fled in the dark, not the anxious woman who had spent the months before her wedding braced for disappointment, but someone closer to the girl she had been in this very village years before fear had learned to live so comfortably inside her. She thought often of Gideon during those quiet hours. She remembered small things about him she had barely noticed amid her own fear on their wedding day. The careful way he had helped her from the carriage, the brief, unexpected warmth in his eyes when their hands had touched during the ceremony, the fact that he had never once raised his voice to her in all the weeks of their brief courtship, even when she had been distant and unresponsive to his attempts at conversation. He was not Edmund. She knew that, somewhere beneath the fear, but knowing it and trusting it were two very different things, and she was not yet certain she had the courage to test the difference. Meanwhile, word of the missing Duchess had begun to spread beyond the walls of Ashcombe, despite Gideon's efforts to contain it. Servants talked, and servants had families, and families had neighbors eager for news of any kind, especially news involving a duke. By the end of the first week, whispers had reached London drawing rooms, twisted and exaggerated with each retelling, some claiming the Duchess had fled to escape a cruel husband, others insisting she had run off with a secret lover she had kept hidden from her family all along. Gideon heard none of this directly, since he had left the city behind entirely, following the scattered threads Alice had given him toward the southern coast. But his sister, Lady Eleanor Hartley, remained in London, and she wrote to him daily, forwarding every scrap of gossip along with her own increasingly worried questions about where exactly he was searching, and whether he had found any real trace of Clara at all. He wrote back only briefly each time, unwilling to commit to paper the tangle of feelings that had taken hold of him since Clara's disappearance. He was angry, certainly, at being left standing alone on what should have been the first night of his marriage. But beneath the anger sat something far more urgent, a growing fear that whatever had driven Clara to run was something serious enough that she might be in real danger, somewhere out there, without protection, without resources, without anyone to turn to if trouble found her on the road. He stopped in every coastal town along his route, asking quiet, careful questions of innkeepers and shopkeepers, describing a young woman with dark hair and a torn wedding gown, though he suspected by now she would have found other clothes to wear. Most had seen nothing. A few offered vague, unhelpful sightings that led nowhere. But on the sixth day, in a small harbor town not far from where Clara had grown up, an old farmer mentioned giving a young woman a ride as far as the crossroads on the night in question, a woman traveling alone in a fine dress that seemed entirely wrong for walking country roads after dark. In the village itself, Clara had begun to form small connections beyond Margaret's cottage walls. There was a young fisherman named William Carow, a broad-shouldered man with an easy laugh, who had known her slightly as a child, and now greeted her warmly whenever she passed his boat on the way to the market. There was old Mrs. Pruitt, who ran the bakery and always saved the best loaf for Margaret's household, and who seemed to sense, without ever asking, that the quiet young woman staying at the cottage did not wish to be questioned about her past. And there was a boy named Peter, no older than 8, the son of one of the fishing families, who had taken to following Clara along the harbor whenever she walked there in the evenings, peppering her with questions about the birds overhead and the shapes of the clouds. It was Peter, in fact, who gave her the first real sense that she might belong here again, however briefly. One evening, as they sat together on the harbor wall, watching the boats come in with the tide, he turned to her with the blunt honesty only children seem to possess. "You look sad sometimes," he said, "even when you are smiling. Are you waiting for somebody?" Clara had laughed, startled, and then found she could not quite answer him honestly. "Perhaps I am," she admitted finally. "I am not entirely sure yet whether I want them to find me or not." Peter considered this with the seriousness of a much older person. "My father says the sea always brings back what belongs to it," he said. "Maybe it is the same with people." She thought about those words often in the days that followed, turning them over in her mind as she helped Margaret hang linens in the yard or walked the cliff path above the water. She did not know whether she wanted Gideon to find her, or whether she hoped instead that he might simply let her go, freeing them both from a marriage built on obligation rather than choice. But some quiet, stubborn part of her kept returning to the memory of his hand steadying hers as she stepped down from the carriage on their wedding day, the careful way he had looked at her as though trying to understand something he could not quite name. Margaret watched these small shifts in her with quiet satisfaction, though she said little about it directly. Instead, she found small ways to draw Clara further into the rhythm of village life, teaching her to salt fish for the winter stores, showing her the old paths along the cliffs that led to hidden coves where the water ran calm even when the wind was fierce elsewhere. In the evenings after the work was done, they would sit together by the fire, and Margaret would tell stories of Clara's grandmother, of the woman she had been before age and illness had slowed her. A woman who had once walked these same cliffs with a fearlessness Clara was only now beginning to remember she had inherited. "You have more of her in you than you know," Margaret told her one night, mending a torn sleeve by candlelight. She did not run from hard things either, in the end. She only needed time to find her feet again before she faced them. Clara held on to those words as the days passed, feeling something steady itself inside her that had been shaking loose since the night of her wedding. She began to write, in a small notebook Margaret had given her, trying to put into words the fear that had driven her from Ashcombe, and the strange, complicated hope that had begun to grow in its place. She did not yet know what she would do when Gideon found her, only that some part of her had already begun preparing for the moment she suspected was coming, whether she was ready for it or not. Gideon, meanwhile, pressed on through towns and villages along the coast road, his patience wearing thin with every fruitless inquiry. He had sent word ahead to Harold at Ashcombe twice already, instructing him to manage the growing rumors as best he could, and to intercept any letters that arrived for Clara from her own family, unwilling to let further worry reach her parents until he had something definite to report. He slept little, ate less, and found himself increasingly short-tempered with innkeepers who could offer him nothing useful, though he tried, out of some stubborn sense of fairness, not to let his frustration show too plainly. It was not only anger that drove him forward now, though pride still stung whenever he thought of the whispers surely spreading through London drawing rooms in his absence. It was something closer to dread, a persistent, gnawing worry that had settled into his chest the moment he read Clara's note, and had not left him since. He thought of all the ways a young woman traveling alone at night might come to harm, and each thought pushed him faster along the road, past the point of reasonable exhaustion. On the 7th day following the farmer's account of a woman riding toward the crossroads, Gideon reached a small coaching inn where the innkeeper, after some hesitation and a generous payment for his trouble, recalled a young woman matching Clara's description asking after passage further south along the coast. She had been traveling light, he said, wearing a plain traveling cloak over what looked like it might once have been a very fine gown, and she had seemed anxious to continue on rather than rest for the night. It was enough. Gideon thanked the man, mounted his tired horse once more, and rode on into the gathering dusk, the salt smell of the sea growing stronger with every mile, carrying him steadily closer to the small fishing village where his wife had, at last, begun to remember what it felt like to feel whole again. The morning Gideon rode into the village, the sky hung low and gray over the harbor, and a thin mist clung to the rooftops like something reluctant to lift. He had reached the outskirts just after dawn, his horse exhausted beneath him, his own body aching from days spent in the saddle with barely a night's proper rest. He stopped first at the small coaching inn near the market square, where he learned from the innkeeper's wife, a talkative woman eager to share whatever she knew, that a young woman matching his description had indeed been seen in the village, staying at the cottage of a widow named Margaret Kell on the edge of the cliffs. Gideon felt something in his chest loosen for the first time in a week, a tension he had not fully realized he was carrying until it began, slowly, to ease. He thanked the woman, resisted the urge to ride straight for the cottage without pause, and instead took a moment to steady himself, to think clearly about what he intended to do once he found her. He was not a man who acted rashly, whatever the gossip papers said about his cold, unreadable nature, and he did not intend to start now. He had spent much of the journey turning over the same question again and again. What had frightened Clara badly enough to make her run from her own wedding night rather than simply speak to him honestly? He did not yet have an answer, but he had decided, somewhere along the long coast road, that he would not approach her with anger or demands. Whatever had driven her away deserved patience, not confrontation. He left his horse at the inn's small stable and walked the rest of the way toward the cliffs on foot, following the innkeeper's directions along a narrow path that wound past fishing cottages and drying nets strung between wooden posts. The village was small and unhurried, entirely unlike the busy streets of London he had left behind, and he found himself noticing details he might otherwise have missed: children chasing gulls along the shore, an old man mending a boat with slow, careful hands, the smell of bread drifting from a small bakery near the square. When he finally reached the cottage, its stone walls weathered and its garden climbing wild along a low fence, he stopped at the gate rather than approaching the door directly. Through the small window he could see movement inside, a figure moving between the hearth and the table, and though the glass was old and slightly warped, he recognized the shape of her immediately. Clara. He stood there longer than he intended, watching through the imperfect glass as she worked, her sleeves pushed up, her hair loosely tied back in a way he had never seen her wear it in London, where every strand had always been carefully arranged for public appearance. There was something different in the way she moved here, something looser and more natural, entirely unlike the careful, guarded posture she had held throughout their brief courtship and their wedding day. She looked, he realized with a small jolt of surprise, genuinely at ease, in a way he had never once seen her look in his presence. The realization struck him harder than he expected. He had assumed, without quite examining the assumption, that Clara's reserve around him reflected simply her nature, a naturally quiet and cautious temperament. But watching her now, laughing softly at something the older woman beside her had said, gesturing easily with her hands as she spoke, he understood that the woman he had married had been showing him only a fraction of herself. Whatever fear had driven her from their wedding night ran deeper than simple nerves. It had shaped the entire way she had presented herself to him from the very beginning. He did not knock right away. Instead, he found himself stepping back from the window, turning the realization over in his mind, feeling something between guilt and determination settle into his chest. He had married a woman he barely knew, true, but he had also failed, in the weeks of their courtship, to create space for her to be anything other than careful and composed around him. If he wanted this marriage to become something real, something worth the promises they had made to each other, he would need to do better than simply demanding an explanation for her flight. He walked instead along the cliff path above the cottage, giving himself time to think, the gray sea churning steadily below him. It was there, an hour later, that Margaret found him, having spotted an unfamiliar figure lingering near her home through the same warped window Gideon had looked through earlier. She approached him without fear, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "You would be the Duke," she said. It was not a question. Gideon inclined his head. "Gideon Hartley," he confirmed. "I mean your household no harm, madam. I have come only to see my wife, and to understand, if she is willing to tell me, why she felt she had to run from her own wedding night rather than simply speak with me." Margaret studied him for a long moment, taking in his travel-worn coat, the exhaustion plain on his face, the careful, measured way he had chosen his words rather than demanding entry outright. Whatever she saw seemed to satisfy some private judgment, because her posture eased slightly. "She has told me some of what happened," Margaret said carefully. "Not to you, Your Grace. Before you. I will not share her private history without her permission, but I will tell you this much. Whatever drove her from Ashcombe was not about you specifically. It was about fear that has followed her for years, fear she has never fully faced until now." Gideon absorbed this slowly. "I would like to speak with her, if she is willing," he said. "I do not intend to force her back to Ashcombe against her wishes. I only want to understand, and to know that she is safe." Margaret nodded, seeming to weigh something further before she spoke again. "Come to the cottage this evening," she said finally. "I will tell her you are here, and I will let her decide whether she wishes to see you. But I warn you now, Your Grace, if you come with anger or demands, you will find this door closed to you, whatever your title." "I have no wish to demand anything from her," Gideon said quietly. "I only wish to understand." That answer seemed to be enough. Margaret left him there on the cliff path and returned to the cottage, and Gideon spent the remaining hours of the afternoon walking the shoreline, trying to steady the strange mixture of hope and apprehension building steadily in his chest. Inside the cottage, Margaret found Clara exactly where she had left her, kneading dough at the small table, her sleeves still pushed up and flour dusting her forearms. She looked up at Margaret's expression, and immediately set down her work, some old instinct sensing that something had shifted. "What is it?" she asked. Margaret hesitated only briefly before answering honestly, as she had promised herself she always would with this girl who had come to her door in a torn wedding gown a little over a week before. "Your husband is here," she said. "He arrived this morning. He has been walking the cliffs since, giving you time, I think, rather than forcing his way to the door." Clara felt the blood drain from her face, her hands going still against the dough. "He found me," she said quietly, more to herself than to Margaret. "He did," Margaret agreed. "And Clara, I want you to hear me clearly. You do not have to see him if you are not ready. This is still your home for as long as you wish it to be, whatever he says or wants. But I spoke with him myself, and I did not see cruelty in him. I saw a man who is frightened himself, in his own way, and trying very hard not to make things worse by acting rashly." Clara sat down slowly at the table, her mind racing through everything she had imagined might happen when this moment finally arrived. She had pictured anger, humiliation, perhaps even the cold dismissal of a man whose pride she had wounded beyond repair. She had not pictured patience. "What do I say to him?" she asked, her voice smaller than she intended. Margaret reached across the table and took her flour-dusted hands in her own weathered ones. "You say whatever is true," she said simply. "You have spent years hiding the truth to protect other people's comfort, Clara. It nearly cost you everything once already. Do not make that mistake again, not with a man who has ridden across half of England to find you, and has, by every account I can see, tried to do so with more care than you perhaps expected." Clara sat with those words for a long moment, staring at the dying light through the small window, thinking of everything she had left unspoken in the weeks before her wedding, thinking of the fear that had ruled so much of her life since Edmund Voss had shown her exactly what cruelty could look like wrapped in a gentle voice. She thought too of the careful way Gideon had always treated her, the patience he had shown even now, arriving not with fury, but with a willingness to wait outside her door for as long as it took. "I will see him," she said finally. "Tonight. But Margaret, I do not know if I can tell him everything, not yet." "Then tell him what you can," Margaret said gently. "It is enough to begin with honesty, even if it is not the whole of it. The rest will come when you are ready, and not a moment before." As the sun began to set over the water, painting the sky in soft streaks of orange and gray, Clara changed into a simple clean dress, tied back her hair with careful, trembling hands, and walked to the cottage door to wait for the knock she knew was coming. Outside, along the cliff path, Gideon turned back toward the cottage at last, his heart pounding with a nervousness entirely unfamiliar to a man who had spent his whole adult life keeping his feelings carefully contained, uncertain of everything except his determination to finally understand the woman he had married, whatever the truth turned out to cost him. The knock, when it came, was quieter than Clara expected, almost hesitant, as though the man on the other side of the door was not entirely certain of his welcome. She crossed the small room slowly, her hand trembling slightly on the latch, and opened it to find Gideon standing exactly as Margaret had described him, travel-worn and tired, his usual composure softened by days on the road. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Clara searched his face for anger and found none, only a careful, guarded hope that mirrored something she recognized in her own chest. "May I come in?" he asked finally, his voice quieter than she remembered it being at Ashcombe. She stepped aside to let him pass, and Margaret, sensing the moment required privacy, quietly excused herself to the small garden, leaving the two of them alone by the hearth for the first time since the wedding. Gideon stood near the door for a moment, taking in the modest room, the drying herbs hanging from the low ceiling beams, the worn but well-loved furniture that spoke of a life lived simply and honestly. It was so entirely unlike the grand rooms of Ashcombe that he found himself understanding, even before she spoke a single word, why she had fled here rather than anywhere else. "I am sorry," Clara said finally, breaking the silence first. "I know what I did was unforgivable. You deserved better than to be left standing alone on our wedding night, whatever my reasons." Gideon shook his head slowly. "I did not come here for an apology," he said. "I came because I needed to know you were safe, and because I realized, somewhere on the road here, that I know almost nothing true about the woman I married. I would like to change that, if you will let me." Clara gestured toward the small table, and they sat across from each other much as she had sat with Margaret that first night, though the silence between them now carried a different weight entirely. She folded her hands carefully in her lap, gathering the courage Margaret had urged her to find. "It was not about you," she began slowly, "not directly. I know that must be difficult to believe, given everything, but it is true. I was engaged once before, 3 years ago, to a man named Edmund Voss. My family believes the match simply ended because his interest faded. That is not what happened." She told him then, carefully and in halting pieces much as she had told Margaret before him, about the slow, careful cruelty that had defined those final weeks with Edmund, the way charm had curdled into control, the fear that had followed her ever since, quiet but persistent, waiting beneath the surface of every gentle word any man had spoken to her since. She did not tell him everything, not yet, but she told him enough, watching his face carefully for any flicker of the judgment she had feared for so long. There was none. Instead, she watched something harden in his expression, not directed at her but clearly, unmistakably, at the man she had described. "He hurt you," Gideon said quietly, and it was not a question. Clara nodded, unable to speak for a moment past the tightness in her throat. "And you have carried that fear alone ever since," he continued, piecing it together slowly. "Even into our own courtship, even on our wedding day. I did not know how to tell you," she admitted. "I did not know how to tell you that I wanted this marriage to work, That I did not run because of anything you did, without also admitting what happened before. I was ashamed of it, even though I know now I should not have been. Gideon reached across the small table then, slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she wished, and rested his hand gently over hers. You have nothing to be ashamed of, he said. I only wish you had felt safe enough to tell me sooner, so that I might have understood, rather than simply waking to an empty room and a note. I know, Clara said softly. I am trying to understand it myself, even now. I did not plan to run. I simply could not stop myself once the fear took hold. They sat together for a long while after that, the fire crackling low in the hearth, the sound of the sea drifting faintly through the window as evening deepened outside. Gideon told her, in turn, some of his own history. The early loss of his parents, the years spent learning to run a great estate before he was truly old enough to understand its weight, the quiet loneliness that had settled over him long before their arranged marriage had ever been discussed. It was not the same as what she had endured, and he was careful to say so, but it helped her understand, in some small way, why he had agreed so readily to a match built on practical necessity rather than affection, why he had told himself patience alone would be enough to build something real between them. I do not want you to come back to Ashcombe simply because it is expected of you, Gideon said finally, as the fire burned lower and the hour grew late. I would rather you stay here, safe and at peace, than return out of obligation, and be unhappy every day for the rest of our lives together. Clara studied him for a long moment, surprised by the offer, surprised most of all by how much she believed he meant it. And if I choose to stay, she asked carefully, what happens then? Then I will make certain you are provided for, regardless of what London says about either of us, he answered without hesitation. Your comfort and your safety matter more to me than any rumor, and more, I think, than they perhaps should matter to a man in my position. It was not the answer she had expected, and it left her with more to consider than she had prepared herself for that evening. When he finally rose to leave, taking a room at the small inn near the harbor rather than presuming any further welcome at the cottage, Clara walked him to the door, feeling something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Not quite trust yet, but perhaps the beginning of it. I am glad you came, she said quietly, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she meant it. So am I, Gideon replied, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw something close to real warmth in his tired eyes, before he turned and disappeared down the dark path toward the village below. Gideon did not leave the village the following morning, as Clara had half expected he might. Instead, he sent word to Ashcombe that he would remain along the coast a while longer, and took to spending his days in ways that surprised her more with each passing afternoon. He did not press her to return, and he did not linger uninvited at Margaret's cottage. Instead, he found small ways to be present without demanding anything of her time, walking the harbor in the mornings, speaking with the fishermen about their boats and their trade, even lending a hand once or twice when an extra pair of arms was needed to haul in a heavy catch. Clara heard about these small efforts secondhand at first, from Mrs. Pruitt at the bakery, who seemed delighted to report that the Duke, despite his fine coat and careful speech, had rolled up his sleeves without complaint to help old Tobias mend a broken oar. It was such an unexpected image, a Duke of the realm kneeling on a wet dock with sawdust on his boots, that Clara found herself smiling before she could stop it. On the third day she encountered him herself, quite by accident, as she walked the cliff path with a basket of mending for one of the fishing families. He was sitting on a low stone wall overlooking the water, his coat discarded beside him, watching the boats come in with an ease she had never once seen in him back in London. May I walk with you? He asked, rising as she approached, careful to keep a respectful distance rather than assuming any familiarity she had not offered. Clara considered him for a moment, weighing the strange new comfort of the request against the old, familiar caution that still lived somewhere beneath her ribs. If you like, she said finally, and found, as they fell into step together along the narrow path, that walking beside him felt easier than she had expected. They spoke of small things at first, the names of the birds wheeling overhead, the particular blue of the water in the late afternoon light, the story behind the old lighthouse visible on a distant point of land. Gideon asked careful, unhurried questions about her childhood summers in the village, and Clara found herself sharing memories she had not thought of in years, the time she had fallen from the harbor wall chasing a stray cat, the summer her grandmother had taught her to identify every star visible from the cottage garden. You loved it here, he observed, not quite a question. More than anywhere else in the world, she admitted. I used to count the days until summer came, just so I could leave London behind and come back to this. And now? He asked carefully. Does it still feel the same? Clara considered the question seriously before answering. It feels different, she said slowly. Not less, exactly, but different. I think when I was young this place felt safe because nothing bad had happened to me yet. Now it feels safe because I know I can survive whatever does happen, and still find my way back to something like peace. Gideon absorbed this in silence for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight she had not heard from him before. I would like to understand that kind of peace, he said. I am not certain I have ever truly felt it, not even at Ashcombe, which has been my home my entire life. Why not? Clara asked, genuinely curious. He was quiet for a while before answering, choosing his words with obvious care. I think, he said finally, that I learned very young to associate my home with duty rather than comfort. My parents died when I was 12, and from that day forward, everyone around me treated me not as a boy who had lost his mother and father, but as a duke who needed to be prepared for his responsibilities as quickly as possible. I do not think anyone ever asked me, in all the years since, what would make me happy, only what would make me capable. Clara felt something shift in her chest at that admission, an unexpected kinship rising up beneath her own carefully guarded fear. That sounds lonely, she said quietly. It was, Gideon agreed simply. I did not fully understand how lonely until I stood in that hallway on our wedding night, reading your note, and realized how much I had already begun to hope that marrying you might change that. I do not say that to make you feel guilty for leaving. I only say it because I think, in different ways, we have both spent a long time protecting ourselves from being truly known by anyone. They walked in silence for a while after that, the only sound the wind moving through the grass and the distant call of gulls above the water. Clara found herself studying him sideways as they walked, noticing details she had missed entirely during their brief, formal courtship in London. The way his shoulders relaxed slightly when he was not being watched by a room full of society's sharpest eyes, the genuine warmth that crept into his voice when he spoke of small, unimportant things, rather than the careful, measured statements he offered in public. I think I have been afraid of the wrong things, she said finally, more to herself than to him. What do you mean? Gideon asked. I spent so long being afraid that any man who was kind to me was hiding something crueler underneath, she explained slowly, working through the thought as she spoke it aloud. I think I assumed that was simply what men were, once you knew them well enough. But you have had every reason to be angry with me since I left, and instead you have been patient, even when I gave you every reason not to be. Gideon stopped walking then, turning to face her fully, his expression more open than she had ever seen it. I am not incapable of anger, Clara, he said honestly. I felt plenty of it, standing alone in that hallway, but anger did not feel like it would bring you home, or help me understand why you left in the first place. I would rather understand you than simply be right about being wronged. That evening, for the first time since his arrival, Gideon accepted Margaret's invitation to join them for a simple supper at the cottage table. The three of them crowded around the small hearth as the sea grew dark beyond the window. Margaret watched the careful, easy way conversation had begun to flow between Clara and her husband with quiet satisfaction, offering little comment beyond the occasional dry remark that drew unexpected laughter from both of them. Afterward, as Margaret retired to her small room and left them briefly alone by the dying fire, Clara found herself studying Gideon's face in the low light, searching for the coldness the gossip papers had always attributed to him, and finding, instead, only quiet steadiness and a patience that seemed to have no end. I am not ready to come back to Ashcombe yet, she said honestly. I hope you understand that. I do, Gideon said without hesitation. Take whatever time you need. I will not press you, and I will not pretend I am not hoping you will choose to come home eventually, on your own terms and in your own time. But I would rather wait for that honestly than rush you back into a life that still frightens you. Clara felt tears gather unexpectedly at that, not from sadness this time but from something closer to relief. The slow, careful unwinding of a fear she had carried for so long she had almost forgotten what it felt like to be without it. Thank you, she said softly, for coming after me, and for not being angry when you found me. I could never truly be angry with you for being afraid, Gideon said quietly. I am only sorry it took me this long to understand what you were afraid of, and why. In the days that followed, a quiet rhythm settled between them, that neither had planned but both seemed grateful to find. Gideon took a small room above the Harbor Inn, rather than intruding further on Margaret's household, and each morning he would appear along the cliff path or near the market square, never demanding Clara's company, but always ready to walk beside her if she wished it. She began, slowly, to wish it more often than not. One afternoon, as they walked together past the small stone church at the edge of the village, Clara found herself telling him about her grandmother, the woman who had built the life this cottage still carried in every corner. She spoke of long afternoons learning to bake bread with flour-dusted hands, of evenings spent listening to stories about the sea and the people who depended on it, of the particular kind of steady, unshaken love her grandmother had offered without ever once making her feel like a burden. "She sounds like she gave you a great deal of what you needed most," Gideon observed. "She did," Clara agreed. "I think that is part of why I came here instead of anywhere else. I did not just want to run from Ashcombe. I wanted to run towards something that had always felt safe, something that had nothing to do with fear." Gideon nodded slowly, considering this. "I would like Ashcombe to feel that way someday," he admitted. "Not simply safe because nothing bad has happened there, but safe because it holds something worth returning to." "It could," Clara said, surprising herself with how easily the words came. "If we build it that way together, rather than simply inheriting it as it already stands." That conversation stayed with her long after they parted that evening, turning over in her mind as she helped Margaret prepare supper, as she lay awake later listening to the familiar sound of waves against the rocks below the cliff. She thought of the great echoing halls of Ashcombe, so different from this small, warm cottage, and wondered, for the first time since her wedding day, whether it might be possible to make a place like that feel like home too, not through grandness or duty, but through the same slow, careful honesty she had begun to build with Gideon, here by the sea. Margaret, watching these quiet changes unfold over the following days, found herself increasingly convinced that whatever fear had driven Clara from her wedding night was beginning, gradually, to loosen its hold. She said as much one evening while the two women worked together in the garden, pulling weeds from around the herbs Margaret depended on for cooking and simple remedies alike. "He watches you the way a man watches something he is afraid to lose," Margaret observed, not looking up from her work. "I have seen a great many kinds of men pass through this village over the years, Clara. That is not the look of a man who married you simply for duty's sake, whatever reasons brought the two of you together in the beginning." Clara felt her cheeks warm slightly at that, though she did not deny it outright. "I am still afraid sometimes," she admitted. "Not of him, exactly. More of trusting my own judgment again, after being so wrong about it once before." "That is a different kind of fear entirely," Margaret said gently, "and a far more reasonable one. But Clara, you are not the same girl who accepted Edmund Voss's attentions 3 years ago. You have learned since then to recognize the difference between kindness that asks nothing in return, and kindness that expects to be repaid eventually with your silence and your submission. Trust that knowledge. It did not fail you when it mattered most. It is what sent you running the moment something felt wrong, even before you fully understood why." Clara turned these words over carefully in the days that followed, watching Gideon with new attention, testing, in small quiet ways, whether his patience truly ran as deep as it appeared. She found herself asking him harder questions during their walks, about his expectations for their marriage, about what kind of household he hoped they might build together, about whether he truly meant what he had said regarding her freedom to choose her own path forward. Each time, his answers came without hesitation or irritation, steady and considered, exactly as they had been from the very first evening he arrived at the cottage door. She noticed too the small ways the village itself seemed to have accepted Gideon without ceremony, despite his title and his fine manners. William Carow had taken to teasing him gently about his poor knotwork whenever he tried to help with the nets, and old Tobias had declared him, with gruff approval, a duke worth his salt after their afternoon spent mending the broken oar together. Even young Peter had grown fond of him, trailing after them both along the harbor some evenings, asking Gideon endless questions about London and horses, and whether dukes were required to wear their fine coats even while sleeping. Gideon answered every question with a patient seriousness that made Clara laugh more than once, watching him crouch down to the boy's level rather than simply offering the polite, distant courtesy she suspected most men of his rank would have shown a fisherman's son. By the end of that week, something had settled in Clara that she had not expected to find so soon. Not certainty exactly, but something close enough to it that she found herself, for the first time since fleeing Ashcombe, beginning to imagine a future rather than simply escaping her past. She did not yet know when she would be ready to return, or what shape their marriage might take once she did, but she knew, walking beside Gideon along the familiar cliff path as the sun set gold over the water, that whatever came next, she no longer felt entirely alone in facing it. As the fire burned low and the sound of the sea continued steadily beyond the window, something had shifted between them, quiet but unmistakable, the first fragile threads of a trust neither of them had expected to find so soon. growing slowly stronger with every honest word exchanged between two people who had married as strangers, and were only now, finally, beginning to truly know each other. The stranger arrived on a gray afternoon nearly 2 weeks after Gideon had first appeared at the cottage gate, and Clara felt the old fear return the moment she saw him standing near the harbor, asking questions of anyone willing to answer. She had been walking back from the bakery, a loaf of Mrs. Pruitt's bread tucked under her arm, when she caught sight of him from a distance, a tall man in city clothes entirely out of place among the fishing boats and drying nets. Something in the set of his shoulders, the particular way he held himself as though the world owed him its attention, sent a jolt of recognition through her before she was even close enough to see his face clearly. Edmund. She stopped walking, her heart pounding, every instinct urging her to turn and flee back the way she had come. But he had already seen her. His eyes found hers across the square, and the smile that spread across his face was the same charming, practiced smile she remembered from 3 years before, the one that had fooled everyone around her except, eventually, herself. "Clara," he called out, closing the distance between them with unhurried steps. "What a surprise, finding you here of all places." She forced herself to stand still, though every muscle in her body wanted to run. "What are you doing here?" she asked, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage. "I heard the most interesting rumor in London," Edmund said, his tone light and conversational, as though they were simply old friends catching up rather than two people with a painful hidden history between them. "Something about a runaway duchess. I confess I did not believe it at first. But then I remembered how well you always ran from difficult things, and I thought, perhaps it is true after all." Clara felt her hands tighten around the bread she carried, anger beginning to burn through the fear that had first gripped her. "That is not why I left," she said, though she knew he would not believe her, and knew too that she owed him no explanation whatsoever. "Of course not," Edmund said smoothly, his smile never wavering. "Though I imagine your fine new husband would be quite interested to know exactly why you were so eager to run from him, given how eager you once were to run from me as well. It would be a shame if word of our own little history found its way into London society, especially now, with your new title to protect." The threat, though wrapped in pleasant words, was unmistakable, and Clara felt the old, familiar cold spreading through her chest, the same helpless fear she remembered from the final weeks of their engagement, when his gentle voice had so often carried exactly this kind of quiet menace beneath its surface. "What do you want?" she asked directly, refusing to let her voice shake. Edmund's smile widened slightly, as though pleased she had finally asked the real question. "Nothing so terrible," he said. "A small sum, perhaps, to ensure my discretion. Surely a duke's wife can spare such a trifle to protect her reputation and his." Clara stared at him, feeling something shift inside her that she did not immediately recognize. It was not simply fear anymore, though the fear remained. It was something closer to clarity, a sudden, sharp understanding of exactly what kind of man stood before her, still using the same tactics he always had, still assuming she was the same frightened girl who had once believed his cruelty was somehow her fault to manage and hide. "I will not give you anything," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. "And I will not be threatened by you again, Edmund. Whatever you think you know about my past, it does not belong to you to use against me." Something flickered across his face at that, a brief flash of the colder anger she remembered from beneath his charm, before he composed himself once more. "We shall see how confident you feel once your husband learns the truth of what happened between us," he said, his voice losing some of its earlier warmth. "I doubt a duke wishes to discover his wife carries such a scandalous history." He left her standing there in the square, walking away with the same unhurried confidence he had arrived with, and Clara stood frozen for several long moments before she finally forced her legs to move, hurrying back toward the cottage with her heart pounding painfully against her ribs. She found Gideon there already, having arrived early for their usual afternoon walk, and the moment he saw her face, his own expression shifted immediately from warmth to concern. "What has happened?" he asked, closing the distance between them quickly. Clara struggled for a moment to find the words, old habits of silence and shame rising up even now, before she remembered Margaret's advice, remembered the trust she had been slowly building with this man over the past 2 weeks. She took a steadying breath and told him everything: the encounter in the square, Edmund's veiled threats, the demand for money to buy his silence about a history she had never fully explained even to Gideon himself. By the time she finished, Gideon's expression had hardened into something Clara had never seen from him before, a cold, controlled anger that seemed to fill the small room with its intensity, though none of it was directed at her. "Where is he now?" Gideon asked, his voice dangerously quiet. I do not know, Clara admitted. He left after speaking with me. I assume he is staying somewhere in the village, waiting for my answer. Gideon was quiet for a long moment, and Clara watched him carefully, bracing herself for questions about the details of her history with Edmund that she had not yet fully shared. Details that suddenly felt more urgent to explain, now that the threat of exposure loomed so close. There is more, she said quietly, before he could ask, about what happened between us, 3 years ago. I did not tell you everything before, because I was ashamed, and because I did not think it mattered anymore. But if he intends to spread lies or half-truths about it, I would rather you hear the whole truth from me first. Gideon's expression softened slightly, though the anger beneath it remained banked and ready. You owe me no explanation you are not ready to give, he said. But if you wish to tell me, I will listen, and I promise you now, whatever you tell me will not change how I see you. Clara told him then, fully and without the careful omissions she had allowed herself before, about the specific cruelties Edmund had shown her in those final weeks, the way he had controlled her movements and her friendships, the fear he had instilled in her with nothing more than a cold look or a quietly cutting remark, the final confrontation that had convinced her, at last, to end the engagement regardless of the scandal it might cause. She told him too about the shame that had followed her ever since, the belief that somehow she had invited his cruelty by not recognizing it sooner, by staying as long as she had before finally finding the courage to leave. Gideon listened without interruption, his jaw tight, his hands clenched at his sides throughout much of her account. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment before he spoke again. None of what he did to you was your fault, he said finally, his voice low and certain. And I promise you, Clara, he will not threaten you again, not while I have any say in the matter. What will you do? She asked, uncertain whether to feel relief or fresh worry at the determination in his voice. I will speak with him myself, Gideon said, not with threats of my own, though I confess I am tempted. I will simply make clear to him exactly what will happen if he attempts to spread lies about you, or if he ever approaches you again for any reason. A man like that relies on the fear of the people he has hurt. He does not expect to face someone willing to stand fully in their defense. Clara felt something unwind slowly in her chest at those words, a fear she had carried for 3 long years beginning, for the first time, to feel like something that could actually be faced rather than simply endured in silence. I want to be there, she said suddenly, surprising herself with the certainty of it. When you speak with him, I do not want to hide from this any longer. Gideon studied her for a long moment, clearly weighing the offer carefully before he nodded. If that is truly what you wish, he said. But Clara, you do not have to prove anything to me by facing him. You have already proven more courage than most people ever have to. I know, she said, but I want to prove it to myself. They found Edmund that evening at the small harbor inn, seated near the fire with a glass of wine, his composure fully restored, as though the earlier confrontation in the square had never happened. His expression shifted only slightly upon seeing Gideon beside Clara. A flicker of surprise quickly smoothed back into practiced charm. Your Grace, he said, rising with a slight bow that did not fully mask his wariness. I did not expect the pleasure of meeting you so soon. Gideon did not return the courtesy. I understand you have been threatening my wife, he said, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable authority that filled the small room. I have come to inform you that this ends tonight. Edmund's smile faltered slightly, though he attempted to maintain it. I am not certain what you have been told, Your Grace, but I assure you, I only wish to speak with an old acquaintance. Do not insult either of us by pretending, Gideon said flatly. I know exactly what you did to her 3 years ago, and I know exactly what you attempted today. You will leave this village by morning, and you will never approach my wife again, in person or by letter, for any reason whatsoever. Should you attempt to spread lies about her history, you will find that I have considerably more resources and considerably more patience for a prolonged legal battle than you do, and I will use every one of them against you without hesitation. Edmund's composure cracked further under the weight of Gideon's steady, unwavering gaze, and Clara watched, with something like wonder, as the man who had once frightened her so completely seemed to shrink beneath the quiet authority of her husband's certainty. This is hardly necessary, Edmund began, but Gideon cut him off before he could finish. It is entirely necessary, Gideon said. You spent years making her believe her fear of you was somehow shameful, something to be hidden rather than confronted. That ends now. She has nothing left to fear from you, and you would do well to remember that before you consider troubling her again. Edmund looked between them for a long moment, calculating, before something in Gideon's expression finally convinced him the threat was not an idle one. He gathered his coat without another word, offered a stiff, wordless nod, and left the inn without a backward glance, disappearing into the darkness beyond the firelight. Clara stood beside Gideon in the quiet that followed, feeling something powerful settle over her, not simply relief, though that was part of it, but something closer to freedom, the sense of a weight she had carried for 3 long years finally, truly, beginning to lift from her shoulders. "Thank you," she said softly, turning to face him. "You do not need to thank me for defending you," Gideon said gently. "That is not a debt between us, Clara. It is simply what should have happened for you a long time ago, and I am only glad I was finally able to help make it right." They did not go straight back to the cottage. Instead, Gideon suggested they walk along the harbor wall for a while, where the night air was cool and the water lapped quietly against the stones, and Clara found she was grateful for the extra time before facing Margaret's inevitable questions. "I keep waiting to feel afraid again," she admitted, watching the dark water shift beneath the moonlight. "It has been so long since I did not carry that fear with me everywhere I went. It feels strange, standing here without it." Gideon walked beside her in comfortable silence for a moment before answering. "Perhaps it will take time before you fully believe it is gone," he said. "Fear like that does not always leave the moment the danger does, but I hope, in time, you will find you trust the quiet more than you expect to." She glanced at him, studying the strong line of his profile in the moonlight, thinking of the man she had married a stranger only weeks before, and the man walking beside her now, someone she had come to know slowly and honestly, piece by careful piece. "I do not think I would have found the courage to face him tonight without you beside me," she admitted. "I think you underestimate yourself," Gideon said. "You were the one who told him you would not be threatened. I only made certain he understood the consequences of ignoring you." Clara considered that for a moment, turning the memory over in her mind, the way her own voice had remained steady even as her heart pounded, the way she had chosen, for the first time in 3 years, to name the truth aloud rather than swallow it in silence. "Perhaps we did it together," she said finally, and Gideon's answering smile, small but genuine, told her the words had landed exactly as she intended. They found Margaret waiting by the fire when they finally returned, her expression carefully neutral, though Clara could see the concern she had been holding back since they left earlier that evening. "Well," Margaret said simply, setting down her mending, "tell me everything." Clara sat down beside her and recounted the evening in full, the confrontation at the inn, Edmund's hollow bluster crumbling beneath Gideon's steady resolve, the strange, unfamiliar lightness that had settled over her in its aftermath. Margaret listened with quiet satisfaction, and when Clara finished, she reached over and squeezed her hand firmly. "I told you the shame was never yours to carry," Margaret said. "Perhaps now you will finally believe it." "I am beginning to," Clara admitted, and found, to her own surprise, that she meant it fully for the first time. Over the following days, word moved quietly through the village that the stranger who had been asking troubling questions near the harbor had left as suddenly as he arrived, and life settled back into its familiar rhythms, the fishing boats going out each morning, the market square filling with voices each afternoon, Peter trailing after Clara and Gideon on their evening walks with his usual stream of curious questions. But something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface of that familiar routine, a lightness in Clara's step that even Mrs. Pruitt at the bakery remarked upon, a new ease in the way she laughed and spoke that had not been there even in the calmer days before Edmund's brief, unsettling appearance. Gideon noticed it too, watching her across the cottage table during the simple suppers he had continued to share with her and Margaret most evenings, seeing the careful guardedness that had once shadowed her expression finally beginning to fade into something closer to genuine ease. He said little about it directly, unwilling to make her self-conscious of a change she was still growing into, but he found himself, more than once, simply watching her with a quiet contentment he had never expected to feel for the wife he had married for reasons of duty rather than affection. One evening, as they walked the cliff path together while the sun set gold and orange over the water, Clara stopped and turned to face him directly, something resolute in her expression that told him she had been considering her words carefully. "I think I am ready to talk about going home," she said. "Not today, perhaps, but soon. I do not want to run from Ashcombe the way I ran from Edmund's shadow for 3 years. I want to walk back into that house because I have chosen to, not because I am afraid of what happens if I do not." Gideon felt something warm settle in his chest at those words, though he kept his response measured, unwilling to rush her even now. "Whenever you are ready," he said. "I will not pretend I have not hoped for this. But I want you to be certain, Clara. Ashcombe will still be there whenever you decide the time is right." "I know," she said, a small smile touching her lips for the first time in days. "I think that is exactly why I am finally ready to consider it. As they walked back toward the cottage together beneath a sky scattered with stars, Clara felt, for the first time since fleeing her own wedding night, that the fear which had shaped so much of her life had finally, truly, begun to lose its hold over her. The morning Clara chose to leave the village, the sky was clear and bright over the harbor, entirely unlike the gray dawn she had arrived beneath weeks before in a torn wedding gown, running from a fear she had not yet learned how to name. She stood in the small garden behind Margaret's cottage, packing the few belongings she had gathered during her stay into a modest trunk, when Margaret found her there, watching with an expression that mixed pride and quiet sadness in equal measure. "You do not have to go," Margaret said, though they both knew it was not truly an offer meant to change Clara's mind, only an acknowledgement of the choice being made. "I know," Clara said, folding a worn shawl carefully into the trunk, "but I want to. That is the difference this time, Margaret. I am not running toward Ashcombe out of fear or obligation. I am choosing to walk back into that life because I believe now that I can build something real there, something worth having." Margaret studied her for a long moment, then reached out and pulled her into a firm embrace. "Your grandmother would be proud of you," she said, her voice thick with emotion she rarely allowed herself to show, "not simply for surviving what happened to you, but for finding your way back to yourself afterward. That is the harder thing, and you have done it." Clara held onto her tightly, feeling the weight of everything this small cottage had given her over the past weeks. Safety when she needed it most, honesty when she was finally ready to speak it, and the quiet, steady love of a woman who had asked nothing of her, except that she heal in her own time. "I will come back to visit," she promised, "often. This will always be a part of who I am, wherever I live." "See that you do," Margaret said, wiping her eyes with brisk efficiency before the moment could grow too heavy. "And bring that husband of yours along with you. He has become rather less useless than I expected a duke to be." Clara laughed at that, the sound easy and unguarded, and felt her heart lighten further as she carried her trunk out to where Gideon waited with the carriage he had arranged for their journey home. He greeted her with a warmth that had grown steadily more natural over the past weeks, helping her up into the carriage with the same careful attention he had shown on their wedding day, though everything between them felt entirely different now, built on honesty rather than obligation. As the carriage pulled away from the village, Clara turned back for one last look at the small stone cottage, at Margaret standing in the garden gate, at the harbor beyond where William Carrow was already out on the water, and Peter waved enthusiastically from the shore. She felt a pang of sadness at leaving, but beneath it, something steadier and more certain, the knowledge that she was not losing this place, only carrying it forward with her into whatever came next. The journey north passed differently than her desperate flight south had weeks before. Where that night had been a blur of fear and exhaustion, this journey unfolded slowly and comfortably. Gideon and Clara talking easily through the long hours, stopping at pleasant inns along the way rather than pressing on through darkness, taking time to simply enjoy each other's company, in a way neither of them had truly experienced during their brief, formal courtship before the wedding. "You seem different," Gideon observed on the second day of travel, watching her look out at the passing countryside with open curiosity, rather than the careful, guarded composure she had worn throughout their earlier acquaintance. "I feel different," Clara admitted. "I think I spent so many years being careful, being quiet, being exactly what everyone expected of me, that I forgot there was another way to live. These past weeks reminded me." "I am glad," Gideon said simply. "I would rather know the woman you actually are than the careful version you felt you had to show me before." Clara reached across the carriage and took his hand, a small gesture that would have felt impossible to her weeks before, and found that it felt entirely natural now. "I think I am ready to let you know her fully," she said, "if you are still willing." "I have been willing since the moment I found you at that cottage," Gideon said, his voice steady with a certainty that warmed her through completely. "I only needed you to be ready as well." They arrived at Ashcombe on a clear afternoon, the great house rising up before them exactly as it had on her wedding day, though Clara found she viewed it now with entirely different eyes. Where once its grand halls and unfamiliar portraits had felt like a cage closing around her, she saw now the possibility of what it might become, a home built slowly and honestly, room by room, rather than simply inherited as an obligation to be endured. The household staff gathered to welcome them, Harold at their head, his expression carefully composed though Clara could see the relief evident beneath his professional bearing. "Welcome home, Your Grace," he said, bowing formally before adding, with a warmth that surprised her, "We are very glad to see you safely returned." "Thank you, Harold," Clara said, and meant it fully. The following weeks brought their own quiet challenges, of course. There were whispers still circulating through London society about the runaway Duchess, questions Clara had to learn to face with the same steadiness she had found in confronting Edmund at the Harbour Inn. There were adjustments to be made in learning to run a household so much larger than anything she had managed before, lessons in the particular rhythms and expectations of Ashcombe that Gideon patiently helped her navigate, rather than simply expecting her to know instinctively. But beneath all of it ran a steadiness that had not existed before her flight to the coast, a foundation of honesty between them that made even the difficult adjustments feel manageable rather than overwhelming. Gideon made a point of asking her opinion on household matters she suspected previous mistresses of Ashcombe might never have been consulted about, deferred to her preferences in small decisions about the house and its management, and continued, in quiet ways, the same patient attentiveness that had first drawn her trust back at Margaret's cottage. One afternoon, several weeks after their return, Clara stood in the estate's overgrown east garden, an area that had clearly been neglected for years, and found herself thinking of the small, carefully tended garden behind Margaret's cottage, the way tending something with her own hands had helped her find her footing again during those difficult weeks. She mentioned the thought to Gideon that evening over supper, somewhat hesitantly, uncertain whether such an ordinary request would seem strange coming from a duchess. "I would like to restore it myself," she said. "Not simply direct the gardeners, but actually work in it myself, the way I did at Margaret's cottage. I know that is not typical for someone in my position." Gideon considered this for only a moment before nodding. "Then you shall," he said simply. "Ashcombe has followed enough rigid expectations for long enough. I think it is past time this house reflected something of who actually lives in it, rather than simply who is expected to." Clara felt a warmth spread through her at his easy acceptance, a small but meaningful confirmation of everything she had begun to believe possible between them during their weeks apart. Over the following months, that east garden slowly transformed under her careful attention, filling with the same herbs and flowers Margaret had taught her to tend, a living reminder of the place that had given her back to herself when she needed it most. Word of Clara's happiness, genuine and unmistakable, gradually reached even the sharpest tongues of London society, and the whispers about the runaway Duchess slowly faded into something closer to admiration, for a marriage that seemed, against all expectation, to have grown into something real. Lady Eleanor, Gideon's sister, became a frequent and welcome visitor, delighted to find her brother transformed from the guarded, solitary man she had always known into someone who laughed more easily and spoke more openly than she had ever witnessed before. "You have changed him," Eleanor told Clara one afternoon, watching Gideon from across the garden as he helped their young nephew build a small boat to sail in the estate's ornamental pond. "I did not think anyone could, but you have." "I think we changed each other," Clara said honestly, watching Gideon's easy laughter drift across the lawn toward them. "I was so afraid of trusting anyone again after what happened before. He gave me room to find my way back to trust slowly, rather than demanding it before I was ready." That autumn, nearly a year after her desperate flight from her own wedding night, Clara and Gideon returned together to the small coastal village that had given her refuge when she needed it most. Margaret welcomed them both with open arms, delighted to see the change in Clara, the easy confidence that had replaced her earlier guardedness, and equally pleased to find that Gideon had indeed grown considerably less useless, as she liked to remind him with dry affection whenever the opportunity arose. They walked the familiar cliff path together on their last evening there, the sea stretching gold and endless beneath the setting sun, and Clara found herself thinking back to that first desperate night, the fear that had driven her from Ashcombe, the uncertainty that had followed her every step along the dark coast road. She had believed then that this cottage was the only place she would ever truly feel safe. She understood now that safety had never truly belonged to the place itself. It belonged to the freedom to be fully herself, without fear of judgment or cruelty, a freedom she had first rediscovered within these familiar stone walls and had since learned, slowly and carefully, to carry with her wherever she went, even into the grand halls of Ashcombe that had once felt so foreign and cold. "I used to think I would only ever feel safe here," she said quietly, watching the waves break against the rocks below. "And now?" Gideon asked, taking her hand in his. "Now I know that safety is not a place at all," Clara said, turning to look at him fully, her expression open and unguarded in a way that would have seemed impossible to her a year before. "It is knowing I have someone beside me who will never ask me to hide who I truly am." Gideon drew her close, the sea wind carrying the salt scent she had loved since childhood, and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Then you will always have that," he said softly. "Wherever we are, whatever comes next, you will always have that with me." The next morning, Before their carriage departed for the journey back to Ashcombe, Clara walked once more through the small garden behind Margaret's cottage, running her fingers over the herbs she had helped plant during her first difficult weeks there. Peter found her there, taller now than when she had first met him, and considerably more talkative, full of questions about whether Ashcombe truly had 100 rooms as village rumor claimed, and whether she still thought of the sea now that she lived so far from it. "I think of it every single day," Clara told him honestly. "I have planted a garden of my own, back at Ashcombe, filled with the very same herbs your mother uses in her cooking. Whenever I work in it, I remember this place, and I remember all of you." Peter seemed satisfied by this answer, and ran off toward the harbor to tell William Carrow that the Duchess had planted a garden just like Margaret's, leaving Clara smiling after him, grateful beyond words for the small, ordinary kindnesses this village had shown her when she needed them most. Margaret walked her to the carriage a short while later, and the two women embraced for a long moment before parting, neither quite ready to let the moment end. "You have built something good," Margaret said, studying Clara's face with the same careful attention she had shown that first frightened morning weeks before, though everything about her now was steadier, calmer, more entirely herself. "I am proud of you, child. Your grandmother would be too. I could not have found my way there without you," Clara said. "This cottage, and everything you gave me here, changed the entire course of my life. I will never be able to repay that." "You already have," Margaret said, squeezing her hands firmly. "Simply by living well, and by being happy. That is repayment enough for an old woman who only ever wanted to see you find your feet again." The journey back to Ashcombe passed comfortably, Gideon and Clara settling into the easy companionship that had become second nature between them over the past year. As the great house finally came into view along the winding drive, its stone walls catching the late afternoon light, Clara felt none of the dread that had gripped her on her wedding day, only a quiet, settled sense of homecoming. The following spring brought its own quiet joys to Ashcombe. The east garden Clara had restored bloomed fully for the first time since her arrival, filling the air with the scent of the same herbs and flowers that had once grown behind Margaret's cottage. Lady Eleanor visited often, bringing her young nephew along to play in the garden paths while the adults took tea on the terrace. And even Harold, ever formal in his duties, had grown visibly fonder of the household's new mistress, quietly ensuring the kitchens kept a steady supply of the particular seed cake Clara had grown fond of during her time by the sea. Gideon, too, had changed in ways the wider household noticed and quietly remarked upon. Where once he had kept to his study for long hours, managing the estate's affairs with solitary focus, he now made a point of joining Clara each afternoon in the garden, or walking with her along the estate's own modest stretch of parkland, finding in these small shared moments a contentment he had never expected marriage to bring him. One evening, as they sat together on the terrace watching the sun set over the newly blooming garden, Gideon turned to Clara with an expression she had come to recognize as thoughtful consideration, the same look he wore when weighing an important decision carefully before speaking it aloud. "I have been thinking," he said, "of establishing a small trust to support women in situations similar to the one you once faced. Somewhere they might find refuge and support, the way you found it with Margaret, without needing to rely on chance or a grandmother's old cottage to provide it." Clara felt her breath catch slightly at the thought, moved deeply by the idea. "That would mean a great deal," she said softly, "to women who have no Margaret of their own to run to." "Then we shall make certain more of them do," Gideon said simply, and Clara reached for his hand, feeling once again the quiet steadiness of the partnership they had built together, one choice and one honest conversation at a time. By the following autumn, the trust Gideon had proposed had taken shape fully. A modest but growing fund that provided safe housing and practical support for women fleeing difficult circumstances, overseen in part by Clara herself, who found in the work a purpose that extended far beyond the walls of Ashcombe. She met, through this work, women whose stories echoed pieces of her own, and found she could offer them something Margaret had once offered her, not judgment or pity, but simple, steady understanding, and the assurance that safety, once lost, could always be found again. Standing once more in her garden on a quiet evening nearly 2 years after that desperate flight from her own wedding night, Clara thought back on everything that had brought her to this moment, the fear that had once ruled so much of her life, the courage it had taken to finally name it aloud, the patient, steady love that had met her honesty with nothing but acceptance in return. She thought of Margaret's cottage by the sea, still standing exactly as it always had, ready to welcome her whenever she wished to return, and she thought of this garden, grown from the same soil of memory and healing, blooming now in a place she had once believed could never feel like home. Gideon found her there as the last light faded from the sky, and slipped his arm easily around her shoulders, the gesture as natural now as breathing. "What are you thinking of?" he asked quietly. Clara leaned into him, watching the first stars appear above the garden she had built with her own 2 hands, in a home she had chosen freely, beside a man who had never once asked her to be anything other than fully herself. "I am thinking," she said, "that I finally understand what it means to be truly safe. And I am grateful, every single day, that you were patient enough to help me find it." They stood together in the quiet garden as evening settled fully around them, 2 people who had begun as strangers bound by obligation, and had built, slowly and honestly, a love strong enough to last a lifetime, together, exactly as they were. 3 years after that desperate night she had fled Ashcombe in a torn wedding gown, Clara stood in the nursery that had once been a dusty, unused room at the far end of the east wing, watching the late afternoon light fall across a small wooden cradle she had chosen herself from the village carpenter near the coast. She was carrying their first child, and though the household had greeted the news with quiet joy, Clara found herself, in private moments like this one, wrestling with a fear she had not expected to feel again so strongly. It was not the same fear that had once driven her from her own wedding night, not exactly, but it shared the same roots, a worry that she might somehow fail at something so important, that the careful peace she had built for herself might crack under the weight of a responsibility this large. She confided this to Gideon one evening as they sat together in the garden she had grown from nothing over the past 2 years, the herbs and flowers now full and fragrant around them in the warm summer air. "I keep thinking of my own mother," she admitted, resting a hand over the small curve of her stomach. "She was never unkind to me, not truly, but she was distant, always more concerned with appearances than with understanding who I actually was. I am afraid of becoming that kind of mother myself, however much I do not wish it." Gideon considered this carefully before answering, as he always did when Clara shared something difficult with him. "You have spent the last 3 years learning exactly the opposite of that kind of distance," he said gently. "You built a trust to help women who had no one to turn to. You listened to every person who works in this house as though their concerns matter as much as your own. I do not think a woman capable of that kind of attention could ever become the mother you fear." Clara turned his words over carefully, feeling some of the worry ease, though not disappear entirely. "I suppose I will not truly know until the child arrives," she said. "Perhaps not," Gideon agreed, "but you will not be facing it alone, whatever comes. I intend to be there for every difficult night and every uncertain morning, exactly as you were there for me when I needed to learn how to be patient rather than simply dutiful." That conversation stayed with her through the following months, a quiet reassurance she returned to whenever the old fear crept back in. She continued her work with the trust throughout her pregnancy, meeting regularly with the women who had found refuge through its support, and found, in their stories, an unexpected source of strength. Many of them had faced far greater uncertainty than she now carried, and had found, through patience and support, the courage to build entirely new lives for themselves. Their resilience reminded her, again and again, that fear did not have to determine the outcome, only the effort required to move through it. It was during this time that an unexpected complication arose, one that tested the steady foundation Clara and Gideon had built together in ways neither of them had anticipated. A distant cousin of Gideon's late father, a man named Charles Whitfield who had long resented his own lesser inheritance, began quietly spreading rumors through certain corners of London society, suggesting that the charitable trust Clara had established was being mismanaged, that funds meant for vulnerable women were instead being used to enrich her own family, whom he claimed had married into the Ashcombe fortune specifically to access such resources. Clara heard of these rumors first through Lady Eleanor, who arrived at Ashcombe one afternoon with unusual urgency, clearly troubled by what she had overheard at a recent gathering. "It is nonsense, of course," Eleanor said immediately, settling into a chair in the drawing room with barely controlled frustration. "Anyone who has seen the trust's accounts would know the claims are entirely false. But Charles has always been bitter about the inheritance, and he seems determined to use this as an opportunity to cause trouble, whatever the cost to your reputation." Clara felt an old, familiar tightness return to her chest at the news, the same instinct that had once driven her to run rather than face a threat directly. But she recognized the feeling now for what it was, and rather than letting it take hold, she found herself thinking instead of Margaret's steady voice, of Gideon's patient support, of every lesson she had learned since that first frightened night at the cottage by the sea. "Then we shall show him exactly how wrong he is," she said, surprising herself with the calm certainty in her own voice. "I have kept detailed records of every contribution and every expense since the trust began. I do not intend to hide from this, whatever trouble he hopes to cause." Gideon, arriving partway through the conversation, listened with quiet pride as Clara laid out her plan, methodical and unhurried, entirely unlike the panicked flight that had once defined her response to fear. Together, they arranged a full and transparent accounting of the trust's finances, inviting several respected members of London society, including individuals known for their sharp scrutiny of such matters, to review the records personally rather than simply relying on reassurance alone. The review, conducted over several careful days, revealed exactly what Clara had known it would: a trust managed with scrupulous honesty, its funds directed entirely toward the women it was meant to support, without a single irregularity to justify Charles Whitfield's claims. When the results became known throughout London, the rumors he had spread collapsed swiftly under the weight of clear evidence, and it was Charles himself who found his reputation diminished, his bitter accusations exposed as nothing more than jealousy dressed up as concern. "I confess I expected you to want to hide from all of this," Gideon admitted one evening, once the matter had been fully resolved and the household had settled back into its familiar calm. "I know how difficult confrontation once was for you. It still is, in some ways," Clara admitted honestly. "But I learned something important at Margaret's cottage, and again the night we confronted Edmund together. Hiding never actually protects anything worth protecting. It only delays the moment when the truth finally has to be faced. I would rather face it directly now, with you beside me, than spend years afterward wondering what might have happened if I had simply run instead." Gideon reached for her hand, the same steady gesture that had grounded her through so many difficult moments over the past 3 years. "I am endlessly proud of the woman you have become," he said quietly, "not because you no longer feel fear, but because you have learned to move through it without letting it decide everything for you." Their daughter was born on a mild autumn morning several months later, a healthy, strong-voiced child they named Margaret, after the woman whose quiet cottage by the sea had once given Clara back to herself when she needed it most. Word of the name reached the coastal village within weeks, and Margaret herself, now considerably older but no less sharp in spirit, made the journey to Ashcombe for the first time in her life to see the child who bore her name, declaring upon arrival that the nursery needed considerably more herbs hanging from its beams if the baby was to grow up properly grounded in good sense. Watching Margaret hold her small namesake in the same garden where Clara had once confided her fears about motherhood, Clara felt a fullness in her chest that no longer carried any trace of the anxious uncertainty that had once ruled so much of her life. She thought back, as she often did in quiet moments, to the frightened young woman who had run through the darkness on her wedding night, certain that safety could only ever be found in one small cottage by the sea. She understood now, watching her husband lift their daughter gently into his arms while Margaret looked on with evident approval, that the safety she had been searching for all along had never truly belonged to any single place. It belonged instead to the people who had chosen, again and again, to meet her fear with patience rather than judgment, to her own hard-won courage in finally facing what had once seemed impossible to face, and to the quiet, steady love that had grown, slowly and honestly, between two people who had begun as strangers and had built, together, a life neither of them could have imagined on that uncertain wedding day 3 years before. In the years that followed, the trust Clara had built continued to grow, extending its reach beyond London to smaller towns along the coast, offering the same quiet refuge she had once found so unexpectedly at Margaret's door, to women who might otherwise have had nowhere else to turn. She often visited these small houses herself, sitting with the women who stayed there, listening to their stories without judgment, offering the same steady reassurance Margaret had once given her, that whatever had happened to them was never their fault to carry alone. Young Margaret grew quickly, spending her summers much as her mother once had, running along the cliffs near the coastal cottage, learning to mend nets from the fishing families who had long since come to think of the Ashcombe household as simply part of the village's extended fabric. Old Margaret doted on her fully, teaching her the names of every herb in the garden and every star visible above the water, and Clara often stood back during these lessons, watching her daughter absorb the same steady, unshaken love that had once rebuilt her own broken sense of safety. Gideon, too, found himself transformed in ways he had never expected when he first agreed to a marriage of convenience. He spoke often, in later years, of how differently he viewed duty now, no longer as a burden to be carried alone in silence, but as something best shared honestly with the people who mattered most. He became known throughout the county not simply as a capable and fair landholder, but as a man devoted openly and without embarrassment to his wife and daughter, a reputation that would have seemed impossible to those who had once called him cold and unreadable in the years before his marriage. On quiet evenings, when the household had settled and the garden lay dark beneath a sky full of stars, Clara and Gideon would often sit together on the terrace exactly as they had on so many evenings before, saying little, needing little beyond the simple comfort of each other's company. It was in these ordinary, unremarkable moments, Clara had come to realize, that the truest measure of safety could be found, not in grand gestures or dramatic rescues, but in the quiet, daily choice two people made to remain honest with each other, through fear and courage alike, for as long as they both should live. The sea remained, as it always had, a place she returned to whenever she needed to remember how far she had come. But Ashcombe, too, had finally become exactly what she once believed only Margaret's cottage could be, a true and lasting home, built not on duty or fear, but on the simple, enduring foundation of being fully known and fully loved, exactly as she was.